clap for you if you come and visit. It's really sad. Okay, we are gonna finish presidency today. Where am I? What am I doing? Right here. Okay. Okay. We talked about Barack Obama and his approval rating yesterday. There is this graph. It's super confusing to me. It took me like 10 minutes to figure out what it was saying. But essentially what it's talking about is the public popularity of modern presidents. It's interesting because we often see some presidents that actually have a very high approval rating, but then in history and their legacy, they don't have a very strong legacy. And there are some presidents that don't have a very high approval rating while they're in office, but then they end up having a really high legacy, a really well-known legacy. So like one of the things you want to look at, like take a look at Nixon. Nixon is kind of on the lower end, I guess you could say, of public popularity. But then you'll obviously see the last few years are terrible, and that's due to the Watergate scandal. And so he leaves, and his legacy is really that he's kind of known as one of those presidents who sort of abused his power. In essence, he's actually one of the more intelligent presidents we've ever had, and his work in foreign policy is bar none to any other president we've ever had. He has had an excellent ability to communicate with other countries and plan foreign policy in a really well-known way. Reagan, we kind of always look back at Reagan as being this strong, conservative, upstanding politician. In actuality, his numbers were actually pretty volatile and somewhat low right before he was reelected, which is interesting. So it's interesting to see what the popularity actually looked like as opposed to what we remember them as or what we remember them for. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some special uses of power. The president has at his disposal, a variety of special powers and privileges not available to the other branches of government. And there are 3 of them: emergency powers, executive orders, and executive privilege. Emergency powers, these are exercised by the president during a period of national crisis. In fact, there are actually a lot of things that the president can do should the nation be in crisis. We see 2 really good examples of that in U.S. history. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln actually suspended all your civil liberties, meaning that he sort of took away all of those freedoms that you have from the Bill of Rights during the Civil War era, which is, would be interested to see how that would go over today. And then the second would be September 11th. President Bush stretched the executive branch immensely right after September 11th, creating new committees, creating a new cabinet department, making sure that there were things set in place for transportation and other infrastructures to sort of protect us against those things. And we allow that to happen because we consider it an emergency power. Executive orders, these are rules or regulations issued by the president, and they have the effect of law. So when a president receives a law from Congress, he signs it. It is now his job to enforce that law or execute that law. And in order to do so, he has to give some executive orders. These are known as sort of laws that you live by. So I'll give you an example here. The president signed into action a number of years ago a policy called Common Core for the schools of the United States, meaning that we had to meet some standards and all schools had to meet the same standards. It was trying to standardize U.S. public schools to a level that was kind of consistent across the country. All of the things that I have to do in order to meet Common Core are issued through executive orders. It's how the president wants me to execute the law that's been passed. And should I choose, or should my school district choose not to follow that, we could actually be tried in a court of law because we're breaking an executive order. It's something that we are issued to do, and it has the force of law. And then lastly is executive privilege, and this is probably one of the more sensational scandal things that we use in presidential power, but it doesn't necessarily have to be because of a scandal. Executive privilege is simply the right of executive officials to withhold information from or refuse to appear before a legislative committee. It means that they don't necessarily have to provide all of the evidence that might be subpoenaed for them. They don't have to themselves appear before a legislative committee if they feel as though it's not necessary or it could be in the danger of the American public. As far as limiting executive privileges, the courts that held that executive privilege could not be used to prevent evidence from being heard in a criminal proceeding. So executive privilege kind of goes away if there's an actual criminal proceeding. Most of the time we see executive privilege sort of used or come into question when a legislative committee is just investigating. That's not a criminal proceeding. That's just Congress doing their oversight function. But in a criminal proceeding, the president wouldn't be able to use executive privilege. So we have seen presidents use executive privilege. There are two of the more famous ones, which would be the Watergate scandal. President Nixon started to, in the beginning, refused to give out official documents due to executive privilege. And then President Clinton did the same thing during a hearing in the scandal with Monica Lewinsky. Part of the reason with executive privilege is the idea that there are a lot of things that happen in the Oval Office that you're not allowed to know, and a lot of that is just for public security reasons. And when those things are subpoenaed and then they're observed by all sorts of members of Congress, potentially on air, it puts the country in a pretty vulnerable position. So one of the things you have to take a look at is executive privilege isn't just having presidents hide behind that in order to keep secrets from you. It's hiding behind it to keep you safer. We do know that there's a lot that happens in the executive office that is better for us not to know. It's better for those things to be able to stay secret so that those missions can be upheld. And if we know them, we put a lot more people in danger than just the president and the situation that they're talking about. Abuses of executive power and impeachment. So we have had two presidents impeached. One was almost impeached, but he resigned before the impeachment hearing could take place. Impeachment is an action by the House of Representatives to accuse the president, vice president, or other civil officers of the United States to commit treason. So what ends up happening is that the House of Representatives can impeach a president or another official in the executive office. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to leave office. It just means it's a very formal reprimand that they've done something wrong. The Senate can also fall into impeachment hearings, and should the Senate also impeach, then often that president is then removed from power. So we know that Richard Nixon, there were a lot of impeachment hearings that are about to start. He ended up resigning. With President Clinton, the House of Representatives did vote to impeach him, but he was acquitted in the Senate, and so he continued to remain president. And I'm going to show you a video next week. What's actually really quite interesting is that public opinion actually didn't want President Clinton to leave office. About 60% of the people polled wanted him to remain in office even after he was impeached. Because he's a savage. Because he's a pretty great president. Okay. Executive organization. So the cabinet. The cabinet is a really big piece of the executive office. I think next week I'll show you a quick video about the president's cabinet and what they use the cabinet for and things like that. But essentially the cabinet is a compilation of advisors from different departments that come and advise the president when he needs it. They all meet usually on a monthly basis in the cabinet room. It's a special room in the White House. But they're also called upon by the president in any other situation. So on any given day, if the president is dealing with a national crisis or a bill that's coming to him or something that he needs to be more informed about, he'll often request the secretary of said cabinet department to come and brief him on something that he's trying to figure out. There are actually 15 executive departments. And the vice president, no, I'm sorry, there are 14 department secretaries, the attorney general, and the vice president is considered a part of the cabinet as well. We do know that presidents will use their cabinet to their personal liking. So some presidents use their cabinet a lot. Some presidents don't use their cabinet at all. It's really up to their personal choice. Some presidents really like that advisory position. Some presidents would rather just make the decision on their instinct. We also have what we call the kitchen cabinet. This was sort of a term brought about because there were a lot of informal advisors that were often informing the president, in some instances actually in the White House kitchen. And so they're considered the kitchen cabinet. They're informal advisors. They are often chosen by the president to be people that he trusts, to sort of help guide him when he's trying to make a tough decision. You'll often see these are people that have worked with the president for many, many years. Lots of kitchen cabinet members would be advisors from that president's former offices. Sometimes it's people that he's grown close with in Washington, D.C. They're informal. We don't usually know who's in the president's kitchen cabinet. It's sort of the idea that we know that there are people around him that help him make decisions. Some of them we see on TV, and some of them are much quieter. So again, presidential use of cabinets is pretty discretionary. The executive office of the president. So one of the things that you really need to make sure you understand is that the executive office of the president has grown significantly in the last 60, 70 years. There have been just an enormous amount of added duties to the president, added interests to the president, and that expands the executive office. So what we consider the White House office would be the people who work for him to make him do his job. These aren't necessarily the people who work in the White House. Often they work in what we call the EEOB, which is the old executive office building. And it's across the street from the White House. It's actually not really across the street. It's kind of on the corner of the White House grounds. It's a very important place where people may not actually interact with the president on an everyday basis. They do a lot for the president. And they're all headed up by what we call a chief of staff. Each president appoints a chief of staff. It's usually the point man between the office, the White House office, and the president, sort of the gatekeeper. He decides who's going to advise the president. He decides who's in the room at any given time. He decides if it's an issue that he wants to bring up to the president. He decides if he wants to, kind of figure it out without the president. It's a very important task. And we see chief of staffs have a lot of power. I mean, they're the ones who get to choose if you go to the room or not. And so they have a lot of responsibility. They also have a huge staff to watch. So White House office would be press secretaries, speech writers, foreign policy advisors, domestic policy advisors, economic advisors, homeland security advisors, monitoring the constant amount of reports that come to the White House office. Also part of the executive office is the Office of Management and Budget, which we call the OMB. Again, we've talked a little bit about this. The OMB is super important in the sense of the budget, but also in continuously figuring out financially where our country is and what agencies are continuing to need more funds. And so the White House is always working with them. The National Security Council is huge. This is the heads of all of the major security agencies, the CIA, the FBI, military personnel would be in the National Security Council. They brief the president typically on a weekly basis. However, when George W. Bush was in power, part of it was because we were in the Iraq War, the Security Council briefed him daily. These are the kinds of people who are going to let him know about any worldwide issues, domestic issues, as far as safety. And then policy czars. Policy czars are people that the president hires in order to investigate specific policies. They don't have a very specific focus, so they're not simply looking at domestic policy, they're not simply looking at an area. They're people that the president trusts, and basically they're investigators. Oftentimes, at any given week, there are big issues going on, and the president may appoint a policy czar to go ahead and take a look at it and figure out what is the administration's policy going to be on this? What are some of the things that we need to sort of be aware of as we go? So some of the things that I would imagine President Obama has some policy czars on right now, a lot on the gun control issue. It's been a pretty big deal, and the administration is really trying hard to figure out what their policy is going to be. They actually have been pretty vague about where they stand on some of the more specific issues in gun control, things like education, healthcare. So they'll always appoint the policy czar, sort of. Okay, the vice president's job. If you don't know our vice president's name, his name is Joe Biden. He is given, but constitutionally, the vice president isn't given a whole lot of power. It's very vague what the vice president's job is. Essentially, for a lot of reasons, it's simply to hold a spot in case the president were to pass, which is a much bigger deal in 1789 when the Constitution was written. Not so much today because, you know, we normally see that presidents are pretty vigorous and have pretty good health and all of that. One of the biggest jobs that they do is strengthen the ticket. So you'll often see, in fact, you'll start to see some of these candidates, once a nomination starts to come out, will often pick a vice president, and they're usually on the other side of the country. Part of that is because then that ticket is sort of a good representation of the country. So President Barack Obama is from Illinois. He has a very big stronghold in the Midwest. He did not have a very big stronghold in the East. The Eastern Coast was really not voting in favor for him. He lost New Hampshire in the primaries. He was really struggling to sort of appeal to a New England voter. And so he picks Joe Biden, which is like New England's golden boy. They love Joe Biden in New England. He's like quintessential East Coast politician. And so it really did strengthen his ticket. He did really well. And it sort of helped him win the ticket. You can always see this. Things like his contender in 2008 was John McCain, and he picked Sarah Palin. He's doing that because John McCain was not appealing to women very well. He's a very gruff military man. He wasn't doing a whole lot on the women's vote, so he picked Sarah Palin, who's a mom, and she's sort of normal, sort of not. And she gives him something that his ticket didn't have before. Now, her geographic location, not super helpful because she was the governor of Alaska, but I'm sure that helped Alaska come on into John McCain's.
Total 50 people.
Yeah, exactly.
Couple polar bears.
Right. And then obviously supporting the president. Each vice president uses their position in a different way. Some are given specific legislation, specific programs. You're going to see in the State of the Union that we watch next week, President Obama basically throws the idea of curing cancer to Joe Biden, which is a really big job. I will be interested to see how that turns out. But some of them take a really backseat. Some of them aren't very public. Some of them don't do a lot. Some of them do a lot. It's really kind of up to the discretion of that vice president.
He gets paid really well to do nothing.
Well, yeah. I mean,
Yes.
he does a lot, actually, but, and I'm not quite sure, he was making a ton of money before. His family is like quite wealthy. Okay, there he is, Joe Biden. Almost ran for president, but he didn't. As far as presidential succession, obviously he's the next up in line. And then the 25th Amendment is a pretty big deal for the vice president. The 25th Amendment allows the president to leave the presidency office for a period of time with approval from Congress. So what will happen is the president would draft a letter that would say that he's sort of giving up his presidency role. He would sign it, he would send it to Congress, Congress would approve it, and the vice president would then become president. Now, in order to reinstate himself, he writes a second letter, signs it, sends it to Congress, and then he is put back into the presidency role. We don't use this a lot, but The idea here is that we want to be able to have something so that the president in a time of emergency would be able to abdicate sort of the role if necessary. And we've really only seen this twice. Both were for medical procedures. So we've had presidents who've signed it while going under anesthesia and then signed it back when they've come out of anesthesia. And again, part of that is because should something happen in the hour that some president is under, someone has to make decisions. And so it's sort of making sure that that is always put into place. And then when the vice presidency becomes vacant, technically, should there be an issue, it will go to the Speaker of the House. And then the president usually can nominate somebody, and then it needs to be approved by Congress in order for that to take place. So that is it for notes. Are there any questions on the presidency?
How many bathrooms does it have?
In the White House?
Yeah.
I think it's like 27 or something like that.